Back to more or less regular lessons, the last 3 weeks of Sunday school. It will be maybe important to clarify for the kids that we're actually going back in time from where we were. There are certainly some stories that of Jesus after the resurrection. We actually covered, I think, pretty much every post-resurrection appearance in Sunday school last year. So this year we're covering none of them. For the last 3 weeks of Sunday school, we are just going back to some regular lessons from the time of the ministry of Jesus prior to his death and resurrection. Although our story coming up for this week certainly is a fitting post-Easter story as we actually deal with a resurrection. So let's get into it. Mark chapter 5. You'll notice that the verses are split up. There are several places in the Gospel of Mark where Mark starts to tell a story, and then he interrupts himself and tells a different story, and then he comes back to the original story. There are some good reasons for that, and it wouldn't be out of place to do verses 21 all the way to the end of the chapter. We have initially a man named Jairus coming to ask Jesus for help. On his way to help Jairus, Jesus is interrupted and helps somebody else, and then he ends up helping Jairus. Well, your lesson material, for the sake of simplicity, cuts out that whole interruption in the middle, and we just deal with Jairus and his family, which is fine and perhaps easier. But again, it wouldn't be out of place. There's a common theme of faith in both of these stories, but I guess for the sake of simplicity, we'll just focus on the one story, which means kind of actually cutting out a big section of text. So, anyway, the story in Mark chapter 5, a man named Jairus, who's actually a pretty important guy, a synagogue ruler. Just to review, synagogues were places of worship that were spread throughout the Judean countryside, and actually, as we see in the book of Acts, well into Asia. The synagogue is where Jews gather together on the Sabbath for worship. It's a somewhat recent phenomenon in Jesus' day. I mean, they've been around for a few hundred years at that point. The Old Testament, they didn't have synagogues. Everybody just went to the temple. Well, now things are a little bit spread out. You still have the big temple in Jerusalem, and good Jews will go to that temple as often as they can. But if you're living in Judea, which is the Judean countryside, which is where Jesus is in this story. A little hard to get to Jerusalem every week, but so you build a synagogue locally. And then the ruler of the synagogue wouldn't be a clergy per se. He wouldn't be a rabbi who would be preaching in the synagogue. He'd be more like the congregation president slash elder slash board of stewardship, trustee, custodian, and secretary is probably kind of the job that he's doing. A pretty important job and a well respected man. And it's somewhat, I mean, just by virtue of his office, he would have been well respected. And it's somewhat notable that he actually comes and asks Jesus for help. This gives us some insight that although many authorities were no fans of Jesus, there were some that acknowledged him to be, if not the Messiah at this point, a prophet, somebody who came from God, somebody who can accomplish good things. And Jairus needs something good in his life. He has every parent's worst nightmare, a child who is sick to the point of death. And he is, as any parent, a good parent anyway, would be in that situation, willing to do anything to seek anybody's help that can help. And so he goes to Jesus. You know, you can go anywhere. Where are you going to go? Might as well go to the one man who you've heard has been doing some miraculous, amazing things. He falls down at Jesus' feet, which is actually pretty noteworthy for a ruler of the synagogue. He wouldn't. This isn't part of his normal day to fall down, get down on his hands and knees, bow before somebody else. But he throws himself down before Jesus and puts himself completely at the mercy of the Lord, and he implores him earnestly. I mean, you can just picture this a real tear-jerking scene, and this I think of the movie Breakthrough, right? A lot of you I know, a lot went on that trip a couple of weeks ago to see that movie. Picture the parents and especially the mother in that movie. The dad tried to kind of keep his composure most times, but Jairus no doubt loses his composure here. According to our text, he's imploring Jesus earnestly. and he asks Jesus to come and lay his hands on the girl, which actually means this Jairus is not under the impression that Jesus is a doctor. Doctors do not lay their hands. I mean, chiropractor well in many cases, but you don't have a dying patient and lay your hands on them and bring them healing if you're a typical physician. So Jairus knows Jesus is not a typical physician. He's looking for a miracle here. Then we get the interruption, which again I said we'll skip over. And then we get word before Jesus can get to the house, the girl is dead. And Jesus says to the ruler of the synagogue, and this is such a powerful thing here, do not fear, only believe. Man, if there's something you want to send your kids home with Sunday, do not fear, only believe. Don't be afraid of anything. Trust and believe that Jesus is who he says he is. So Jesus and his inner circle of Peter, James, and John go to the house. And of course, there's all these people there who are making a show of extreme grief. You know, anytime you lose a child, there's going to be an outpouring of grief. And in the midst of the outpouring, Jesus says something that if he wasn't Jesus, oh, why are you guys crying here? And then to say, the child is not dead, but sleeping. And of course, they're laughing at him at this, and he knows, and Jesus knows he's doing this quite intentionally to teach a lesson to these folks. But they laugh at him, and then he puts them all outside except for the family, and he speaks to the girl. And Mark includes the Aramaic here. Talitha kumi, which means little girl, I say to you, arise. Immediately the girl gets up, she starts walking, she's about 12 years of age. They're overcome with amazement, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. But telling people not to tell, that's a pretty typical thing in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus doesn't want the word to get out quite yet, and yet the word always gets out. You know, I think we may have examined this before. Why do we have these moments where Jesus says, don't tell anybody, and then the people immediately go and tell? Yeah, the point here, I mean, there's different scholars debate this, but I like the interpretation that this refers to the unstoppable nature of the gospel. The fact that the gospel gets out, the gospel overrides the law, the gospel cannot be contained even by God himself, weirdly enough. So the gospel gets out, and news continues to spread about what Jesus has done. So let's talk a little bit about this miracle, a raising of a girl from the dead. Again, quite appropriate after the Easter season. Central to understanding this is Jesus, his initial comment about the girl's state. He says she is sleeping, and he means it. Just as when we talk about, and when Scripture talks about believers who die, they have fallen asleep. It is a state of being where this is not final, this is not permanent. Just like when you fall asleep, you inevitably get up. When a Christian dies, inevitably they will get up. It is inevitable. You know, that is death is not inevitable. Not going to talk about Avengers quite yet. There's still some people who haven't seen it yet, but death is not inevitable for the believer. It's life that's inevitable for the believer. And so this interim state that this girl is in is representative of the interim state that all believers are in. It just so happens that her state is a little bit shorter initially as she gets woken up. Jesus tells her to wake up, and she does, and she leaps to her feet, and she presumably has a nice long life. Jesus says, eat with your family, or they give her something to eat. This is meaningful. There may be something going on here with kind of when somebody's dead, you know, they're actually ritually unclean, and according to Old Testament Jewish law. I know that wouldn't bother the dead person, but you can't go by anybody and still be clean and still be part of the community if you've touched a corpse or that kind of thing. Jesus, of course, always ignores this. He touches lepers, he touches corpses, whatever. He doesn't care. He's Jesus. He can do that. So the girl is raised, but then the eating is significant because this is readmission into the family, re-entry. When they're eating together, they're a family together. That's what makes it official. And yes, there's some echoes of the Lord's Supper there. We eat the body and blood of the Lord together. This makes us a Christian family together. So this girl raised from the dead. Why? There's a lot of people who die. Jesus only picks a handful of lucky ones to raise from the dead. Actually, that's not true, is it? He raises all who believe in him on the last day. And this is where so important to know about all of Jesus' miracles. They're not just miracles, and they're not magic tricks. They're part of a larger message. And I know I've been bringing this up a few times, but tell your kids that this is a preview of the last day. The resurrection that Jesus brings about for Jairus' daughter is a preview of the last day resurrection that all believers will have. And Jairus believes. He has faith. And his daughter actually is the one who benefits from Jairus' faith and his asking the Lord for help. You know what happens when you ask the Lord for help? He answers you. Now, it might not be immediately, it might be in the last day, but he will answer you. And that's why he's doing these miracles here, to show you that it will happen for you in the last day. You will be raised from the dead. In the story we skipped over too, with the woman who asks Jesus for help in Mark chapter 5, she's also exhibiting faith, and Jesus actually says to her, "Your faith has made you well." So in this case, Jairus' faith in the Lord, results in his daughter being raised from the dead. Now, she does die again at some point. Again, hopefully after a long time, she has a nice full life. So when Jesus is raised from the dead, he's not the first. But there is something significantly different about Jesus' resurrection. He doesn't die again. He is raised for all time. And then any resurrection that will now come after his, and we're actually still waiting for the second one, but actually the second one and the third and fourth and fifth and thousands thereafter, millions thereafter, will all be simultaneously when Christ returns. At that point, Jairus' daughter will be raised up again for what it's worth. But those who are sleeping will be awakened on that day. And that's the day that this miracle is previewing, the day of the resurrection to come. All right. Oh, and in the meantime, people are going to scoff and mock, and they're going to deny the resurrection of Christ, and they're going to deny the resurrection to come. But, well, they actually get put out of the house here, don't they? The scoffers and the mockers. So a little bit of a warning here not to laugh when Jesus says he's going to raise someone from the dead, because he means it. And he said that he's going to raise us from the dead, and he means it. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about the three things we talk about every week. What does the story tell us about God and his mercies? The story tells us that we have a God who is merciful even to the point of death and beyond. We have a God who is merciful on those who have fallen asleep, and he promises them a resurrection to come. And he accomplishes it through Jesus and ultimately through his resurrection. So the announcement has been made here. The grip of death, which right now is still a very present reality in our lives. Any of us can die at any time. We all mourn those who have died. Death is still a reality, but there's a notice here. Death, you're on notice. Your days are numbered.